Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you found that discussion of phrenology rather mentally stimulating. Okay, that was a bad joke. Like I said, I'll give you some advice as we move forward, and this has helped me out a lot in the years I've been doing this. You take your history very seriously, but you don't take it ultra seriously, because if you take it ultra seriously, it'll just end up destroying you. The things that we talk about in this class, the things that you're going to learn in any of these classes, are not going to be pleasant. Unfortunately, there are good things to learn, and there are some things we're going to learn about in this class that won't be quite as dark as others, but you're going to get a hearty dose of some of the darkest things that humanity can possibly cook up, and this unit is no exception. So, like phrenology, for example, is almost hilariously just fun to listen to because of how goofy it is. But then, like I said before, you realize that there were people who believed this. Now, as we move forward in this lecture, it's not going to be nearly as amusing. In fact, it will not be amusing at all. It might be interesting, but it won't be amusing. Phrenology is where the fun stops in this lecture. So as we move forward, it's going to get darker and darker and darker. But again, all of this is very important to learn as we move forward. So that brings us to the second section. Excuse me. This is the second racial science that we will learn leading up to social Darwinism, and that is called polygenism. Polygenism is something that some of you may have heard of before if you studied a philosophy, if you took a philosophy course before, or if you took an evolutionary biology course that was not a traditional biology course so much as it was a almost like a history of biology. Polygenesis was, for a time at least, over the course of the late 19th century, considered a very popular and up and coming response to Darwinian evolution. The practitioners and subscribers of polygenism rejected Darwin's views of evolution for various reasons, and instead opted for a different view altogether, and that would be, we could call, polygenism. There are other forms of this, but collectively we can refer to it all as polygenism. So what's polygenism, you're wondering? Well, if you recall back to the video on Darwin, and I have this here on the slide, so I put here at the very beginning. Let me move back for a second. What made Darwin different was not the fact that he posited an evolutionary force. Contrary to popular belief, if you've listened to anyone talk about Darwin, especially negatively, contrary to popular belief, Darwin did not actually come up with the idea of evolution. The concept of evolution, evolutionary development, was actually around throughout the Age of Enlightenment in Europe and the American Age of Enlightenment as well. There were various scientists and philosophers from this period. A lot of them were religiously what we would call deists. They believed in a god, but they believed in a god that was operating under natural law. Thomas Jefferson was partially a deist, although he did believe in God. He was a Unitarian. That's really taking us off the beaten path, so don't even worry about that term. But people like Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine were deists. George Washington was a deist. They believed in a God, certainly, but they believed in a God that operated by natural law. So many of the early evolutionists, those who believed that man had evolved and that all life on Earth had evolved, believed that evolution took place under the hand of a divine providential power. In other words, they believed that evolution was guided by God. Darwin eventually became an atheist, but his whole deal, his whole shtick, was not a rejection of God, but merely an atheist. That would actually be the correct term. It wasn't an atheist in the I don't believe in God, therefore I'm going to prove it approach, but atheist meaning it was an explanation or a discussion of evolution without necessarily trying to incorporate God. Darwin looked at or developed the idea of natural selection, and that is what we see here on the left. Natural selection was the idea that the strongest, or over time, under certain external pressures, species would develop or adapt themselves to various issues: lack of water, too much water. In the discussion of finches, beaks being long enough to reach into wood to get food versus beaks that were not long enough. The species of finches that didn't have those beaks, did not have those adaptations, would die off. They would not be able to reproduce. The finches with those beaks would live on, they would reproduce. Therefore, over time, and I mean a long time, you had these finches that had adapted these longer beaks become the dominant species and replace most of the finches. That would be evolution. That is an evolutionary response. And taking that a step further, Darwin hypothesized and theorized that not only did natural selection occur, but that you could trace back all of these different branches of life: reptilian, mammalian, avian, so on and so forth, back to a common type of ancestor. So think of the very beginning of Earth's history, when it went from a molten, boiling planet newly created with the newly created sun into a world that eventually developed an ocean, and then eventually life in those oceans, microbial life that grew and developed and evolved over time into eventually what we have today. That was what was sort of the natural backwards thinking of natural selection. Now, believe it or not a lot of people were completely freaked out by this idea. It took a while for people to become more and more resistant to it for various reasons, religious and otherwise. But one of the things that made Darwin stand out was he not only saw the world in this view, but that he also included man, or humanity, as part of it. And that actually raises a number of uncomfortable questions for some people. First of all, people do not want to believe that they came from some other type of being. And also, if we as a race, and by race I mean the human race, all come from a common ancestor, it certainly means that me as a white man and somebody else as a person of a different race must have some kind of biological connection. And as we're going to see moving forward, there were people who were very resistant to that idea because they considered their race to be superior. And so Darwin's ideas are going to have a bit of a falling out with some of those people. And although social Darwinists borrow heavily from Darwin, there were people who opposed Darwin who came up with equally racist ideas. And both batches of people, the Darwinists and the anti-Darwinists, as they move forward, are just equally racist and develop racist ideas and racist ways of viewing the world. Like I said, this lecture is going to be a little all over the place, but you'll see where I'm going here in a few minutes. So let's talk about polygenesis. So this is the lecture slide that you should be looking at now, but of course, like I said before, the video is not here right now because I'm making it. The gentleman pictured on the right, standing next to the chalkboard, is a man by the name of Louis Agassiz. Louis Agassiz was born in Switzerland, and he was a biologist, a geologist. He was a zoologist. He was a naturalist. Like Darwin, essentially, he did a lot of what Darwin did, although he was not quite contemporary. Darwin was a little older. But Louis Agassiz comes from this kind of scientific background. He is a legitimate scientist. He is not like like Leonardo DiCaprio that you saw in that film clip, kind of an amateur. He is an actual bona fide scientist who collects fossils, looks at geological formations, performed taxidermy and autopsy on different animals, and did pretty much a lot of what Darwin did, a lot of observation to make his determinations and make his theories. But unlike Darwin, in his Origins of the Species, where he where he developed this idea and put forth this idea of natural selection and that we all stem from a common ancestor. Aguirre will reject this, and he will eventually develop what becomes a very popular idea in the United States, polygenism. You can read about Louis Aguirre in a book called The Metaphysical Club, which is where I was first introduced to him. And while the book isn't necessarily about him, it's about some very prominent thinkers in American history. He had an indelible impact on several of these men in this book. And if you are an avid reader, if you do like reading very interesting material on ideas and how ideas work and how thinkers think up ideas, the Metaphysical Club is one that I highly recommend. It is not an easy read, but it's not extremely hard either, and I do recommend it. So if you do read it, by the way, for some reason, if one of you is a bit of a bookworm and you read it, or if you have read it, let me know. I'll be curious to hear what you have to think about it. Essentially, polygenism is the opposite of monogenism. So what's monogenism and what's polygenism? Well, monogenism, as you can see here, believe that all the races of the world descended from Adam and Eve. So there's a very religious component here. There's a religious component to polygenism as well, but we'll get to that in a second. But monogenism believes that all the races of the world descended from Adam and Eve, and they came out of the Garden of Eden. They came out of a common home. So all the races of the world have a common ancestor with each other and a common home from which all of them came. They also, monogenists believe that the reason why we see so much variation, so many differences between the races is because of things that happened throughout history. Now, this could be interpreted as being racist as well, because there's no reason why a monogenist can't see the world in racist terms and believe in superiority of races and superiority of ethnicities. But they still see that there's a common brotherhood between members of the human race. This is not necessarily the same with polygenesis. So polygenism believes that when you look at the Bible and they talk about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and all of the biblical figures that are mentioned in the book of Genesis, that what they're really talking about is the white race, not the other races of the world. Polygenicists believe that rather than coming out of one central area, in the case of monogenists of the 19th century, it would be the Garden of Eden. In the case of now, when you look at evolutionary biology, especially where humans are concerned, there is what's called the out of Africa theory, that all humans began or became human, what we would call a Homo sapien, somewhere in the Ethiopian area of Africa, where some of the oldest skeletons, human remains, as well as ones from the Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, people I don't say proto-humans, but our common ancestors are found as well. So, so that could be considered monogenesis. So, out of Africa is used to explain evolutionary human biology today. Polygenicists reject that. They reject the idea that we all came out of Africa. They reject the idea that we all came out of the Garden of Eden. Only whites did. Instead, if you look at a map, where the races are located is pretty much where the races were always located. There was human creation in Asia for the yellow man, human creation in Europe for the white man, human creation in the Americas for the red man, human creation in Africa for the black man, as you can see here. And I do apologize for that kind of masculine language, but I'm just trying to make it easier. But you guys get the point. So rather than stemming from one central source, there were scatterings of different humans that came about at different times. And the differences among the race, lastly, were not because of history. It was simply because of creation itself. The polygenicists don't reject God. They actually believe that God exists. A lot of them are very religious, though there are a lot of monogenists that are religious. As you can see here, they acknowledge Adam and Eve. But polygenists believe that the Bible only talks about the white race. It doesn't talk about any of these other races for various reasons. And this is going to become important later on, because later on we're going to see that Europeans, who are, of course, Christian and use the Bible, they see themselves as being superior. And of course, excuse me, or what makes you what can make you more superior than actually coming from the one true God? So that is the difference between these two. I'm not saying that people who were subscribe to monogenism couldn't be racist, because of course you can see here how they could be. They could still believe in a racial hierarchy. Polygenism almost seemed built for it. That they rejected Darwin because Darwin described a common origin. They also reject Darwin because they don't like to see themselves as part of this larger branch of adaptation and evolution. Instead, God creates us as we are, the way we are. All of our differences are explained through creation. And of course, the reason why the white race rules the world at this time is because of our natural attributes, which were given by creation. So Louis Agassiz does not really write this all out necessarily, although he does write out quite a bit of it. But he has other people, students and followers, who build off of his work. And even as it becomes less and less diminished, or more and more diminished, it becomes less popular as people begin to realize that the Earth is much older, that we more than likely have a common ancestor. A lot of people still subscribe to these ideas. And like phrenology, they may people may come to reject phrenology, and they may come to reject Louis Agassiz and polygenesis, but they still kind of gravitate towards a number of these ideas that he was writing about, these ideas of superiority, differences stemming from creation, differences that could not be reconciled, and so incorporate them into other forms of racism, namely parts of what becomes social Darwinism. This is a map that more or less is the way Louis Agassiz would have seen the world. And so I know it's hard to see, so feel free to copy this picture, maybe blow it up and take a look at it, but you can see the races of the world, the Australian realm and the European realm and the African realm. This is the way creation would have happened. All of these different people would have been created by God in these specific locations. But then you look at the world and you see how Europe has spread to dominate it. So clearly, and we can also kind of see this in the fact that since the Bible is the book of God and God is the creator of everything, that the white race must somehow be favored. There really isn't anything scientific in that. It's mostly based on observation and inference and how he looks at the world, and they collectively reject Darwin. But you can see how this all fits together. A Darwinist, on the other hand, or a monogenist, somebody who subscribes to a common ancestor theory, would believe that all of us kind of walked the earth and slowly populated it. Now, this is a map that shows the out of Africa theory, so you can see how Africans would have gone up and then out or over, because Africa is actually a very large continent. Maybe they wouldn't have believed that. Maybe they would have believed that they would have come from the Garden of Eden, somewhere here in this area of the world, mainly present-day Iraq. But nevertheless, regardless of whether or not you believed in the Garden of Eden or the out of Africa theory, they would have believed in population growth and population movements in this manner, that they would have come from a common source and they would have slowly spread out towards Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and North Eurasia, over into East Asia and Southeast Asia, eventually migrating over to Australia, and perhaps most famous of all, crossing the land bridge from Russia, present-day Russia, into present-day Alaska, the United States, and down, populating these other places of the world. So those are the ideas of monogists, and this is the idea of polygenism. There is racism here. Mainly you can see in polygenism versus monogenism. But again, you're seeing this need, this desire to explain European superior or perceived European superiority, European dominance, and you're seeing this need to classify other people based on their race and ethnicity, whether it's by skull shape, size, the ridges of the skulls, their skin color, where people who look like this seem to dominate the globe. Africans in the United States are descendants from Africans from Africa. Why were Europeans able to take Africans and put them in the United States instead of the other way around? All of this is meant to explain or try to answer that age-old question of why are Europeans dominating the world? So that is Louis Agassiz and polygenesis. Like I said, his reign, and he becomes an American citizen. Actually, he taught at Harvard. There's a dorm named after him. Why there's a dorm named after him, I think, and a biology building named after him, which is absolutely hilarious. But why, even though he starts to fall out of favor and monogenism becomes popular, far more popular at the end of the 19th century, and even Darwin is becoming embraced as social Darwinism will eventually become popular. We'll talk about that in the next section. Even though all of that happens, and I don't want to beat the dead horse, but I just want to reiterate, even though phrenology has kind of died away, even though Louis Agassiz and his ideas of polygenism die away, a lot of these ideas in some way still remain, and they get absorbed into more of these ideas that become part of social Darwinism. So you'll have social Darwinists that disagree with each other maybe on the origins of humanity, but they will agree that whether or not you believe in a common ancestor or you believe that we were created in areas around the globe individually, whether or not you reject the idea that skull shape and size suggest superiority versus, well, that it doesn't, they all seem to agree that there is something within the white race, the European race, that clearly makes us superior to everybody else, and that you can see this, you can qualitate this by how much intellectual power we have, the writers, the poets, the symphonic composers, as if nobody else has anything like that. I think Duke Ellington would disagree. But you see how they have the Bible. The one true God seems to give them more benefits. They have technology. They have free market economics, which we're going to talk about in a moment. They have all these things that seem to be blessings, or no doubt stem from a truly superior mind. So again, while a lot of these ideas kind of die away and they're replaced by forgive the terminology, but bastardizations of Charles Darwin's ideas, they all kind of work together in Congress to explain why white Europeans are the top dogs of the world. So let's talk about social Darwinism, and that will be in the next lecture. So this is where this lecture will end on polygenesis, and we will move on to social Darwinism.